Great. So hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. Today we are going to talk about Visualforce to LWC. Again, this is going to be the fourth webinar in the series. And concretely, we are going to see how to use your existing Visualforce pages with Lightning Web Components. My name is Alba Rivas. I am a developer evangelist at Salesforce, and this is my Twitter handle, where you can ask me questions later if you want to. And I am here with Peter today.
Hey everybody, my name is Peter Chittum. I'm also a developer evangelist, and I am the team lead for the developer evangelist team in EMEA and North America.
Great. So as I said, this is the fourth webinars in the Visualforce to LWC series. This is going to be the last one. For the first three webinars, you have the recordings available in English and in Spanish. And first, I want to present you the slide that we use at Salesforce, because Salesforce is a publicly traded company. And this means that you should make purchases based on the functionality that's currently available. And with that, I'm going to start by reviewing what we explained in the previous webinar. If you haven't watched them, you have the opportunity to do that. In the first webinar, we reviewed the architecture and coding concepts of Lightning Web Components, always from the perspective of a Visualforce developer. We started to talk about how to configure your development environment. We talked about how to debug Lightning Web Components. We compared Visualforce architecture with Lightning Web Components architecture, and we started to talk about things like properties, getters, etc. In the second webinar, which was named Coding Concepts Continued, we continued talking about coding concepts that you can extrapolate from Visualforce to learn Lightning Web Components. We saw how to implement conditional visibility, how to implement iterations, composition, and much more, right? If you see the screen, there are two links for the videos. The first links are for the English recording, and the second link is for the Spanish recording. And finally, the third webinar was about how to work with Salesforce data. This is very important because in Visualforce, you normally use a standard controller or Apex, and in Lightning Web Components, we have more ways to do that. And it's important to know when to use each of the different approaches. So here you have the recordings as well. And with that, let's start talking about how to reuse your Visualforce pages in Lightning Web Components. First, I'm going to give you some tips that you must know to be able to reuse your Visualforce pages in Lightning experience in general, right? So first of all, bear in mind that if you want to reuse Visualforce that you have in your organization and you want to make it available to be visible in App Builder or Community Builder or the Utility Bar, any of the low-code tools that we have in Lightning experience, you have to check a setting, which is this one here that you can see in the screen. This is part of the metadata of the Visualforce page, so you can do that programmatically if you want to, but that's important. For example, the demos that we are going to see today include some Visualforce page in App Builder, and I had to activate that setting. Next, you must know that there is a way in which you can include the Lightning design system style sheets into your Visualforce page and use them. There is a Visualforce tag for that called Apex SLDS. And if you include that in the page, right away, the page is going to download those style sheets, the ones that conform the Lightning experience look and feel, and you are going to be able to use them in your Visualforce page. For example, if you have an existing Visualforce page and you want to extend it with just adding a new portion of code and you want it to look at legs, as legs, you are going to be able to do that this way. And finally, there is a very nice tool. Well, it's really a configuration property that you can use in your Apex pages so that the standard Visualforce component are styled with the look of Lightning Experience. So imagine that you have this Visualforce page here. What you can do is to activate the Lightning style setting in the Apex page definition. And with that activation, when you look at the page in Lightning Experience, the base components, the standard Visualforce components that you have used in the page are going to look much nicer. If you have custom code, the custom code is not going to be changed by this setting, but as you can imagine, the combination of this setting with the inclusion of Lightning Design System style sheets in your page for your custom code can make your Visualforce page much more appealing in Lightning Experience without having to implement a single line of Lightning Web Components code if you don't want to do that for now, right? Okay, so now let's say that you have a Visualforce page, you are happy with that Visualforce page, the performance is okay, you don't want to re-implement that page in Lightning Components, you have changed the look and feel of the page using the tools that I have just mentioned, and you are okay with that portion, but you want to extend that and you want to do that by using Lightning Web Components or Aura Components as well, right? And you want to create a Lightning Web Component that you want to use inside that page for a specific portion of the page. There is a tool that is going to allow you to do that. The tool is called Lightning Components for Visualforce. And as I said, it works both for Aura Components and for Lightning Web Components. So basically, in the tool, we are going to be able to include a Lightning Web Components. You can see here an example in the page that we have a Lightning component in green, and we are including that Lightning component in a Visualforce page, which is in orange. And, well, I already said that both Lightning Web Components and Aura is supported, but the technology that we are going to use to do that is Lightning Out, right? That is going to be used behind the scenes. You are not going to have to configure, for example, the authentication, right? Because that is going to be done for you. But the technology that is behind the scene is Lightning Out. And this is important to know because that means that we are not using an iframe. We are embedding the component itself. And we are going to see that in a moment because we are going to inspect the DOM to see how the combination of the Visualforce page and the Lightning Web component has been done. And as I said, what this technology adds to on top of Lightning Out is that all the authentication is set up for you. You can forget about that. It's not the same as when you are using Lightning Out outside of the platform that you have to configure the authentication. So what we're going to do is to implement this use case here. And for that, well, I have already done it, right? Here we have a Visualforce page, which is the one that you have seen in the presentation, and we have included a Lightning component. The way to include a Lightning component using Lightning components for Visualforce, which is the name of the feature, is to use first a standalone Aura app, which is going to be an app in which we declare the dependencies with that Lightning Web component. We will say that we want to use that Aura app, and then we will create the component dynamically. In my case, the name of the component is my Lightning Web component, and the name of the Aura app is Lightning Web Component Container App. This function receives other parameters. For example, we can set up some initial values to the component API properties. We have to define the ID of the HTML element. This is the portion in which we want to include the Lightning Web Component. We want it to be rendered. And finally, we can define a callback function that is going to execute once the component gets added to the Visualforce page, right? This is the definition of the Aura container app. There are two things that you have to do. First, you have to extend Lightning Out app. There is also an option to extend another class called Lightning Out app unstyled, which doesn't inherit the Lightning Design System style sheets, but I recommend you to use this one. And also you have to make the application global, right? And then declare the dependencies with the components that you want to create dynamically in your Visualforce page. I'm not going to give you more details about the component for now. We are going to open the OR, and we are going to see the result of using this technology to embed Lightning Web Components. Sorry, it opened in a different page. We're going to put it here. And here, I created an app which is called Lightning Web Components for Visualforce. And here we have the page. So first, this part here belongs to the Visualforce page, and this part here belongs to the Lightning Web Components. If you see in the code, the value, the initial value that we passed to a label property was initial label value, right? I'm going to close this. And it happens that that label is a public property that I'm using in the component to define the label of the button. So you can see here that the initial value has been correctly set. Sorry, I just want to go to a different, yeah. Okay, so that's fine. I've explained how to integrate the Lightning Web Component within the Visualforce page, but now, how do we communicate them, right? We need to, in most of the cases, we are going to need to pass information from the Visualforce page to the Lightning Web Component, and we are going to need to pass information from the Lightning Web Component to the Visualforce page. The way to do that is following the same principle that you follow when you compose Lightning Web Components. So basically, if you want to pass information down, you do that by setting a value to public properties or by calling a public method. And the other way around, if you want to pass information up from the Lightning Web Component to a Visualforce page, what you normally do is to fire an event from the Lightning Web Component and to define a listener or a handler for that event in the Visualforce page. We're going to see how to do that. And by the way, I promised to you that I was going to inspect the DOM to show you the aspect of this, of the final DOM that is rendered. This is probably very small. Yeah, so here you can see that we are not using an iframe to embed the component. We are really using the custom Lightning Web Component that we have created, right? Okay, so what about the communication patterns? Well, the first communication pattern that we are going to explore is how to send information down by setting a value to a public property. We have already used a public property in our component, which is the label property. So what we are going to do is to create a method that sets a different value to that property. for that, we are going to query for getting the component, right? You saw in the DOM that the name of the component was C for custom, is the custom namespace, and then the name of the component in kebab case. So what we do is to query for that component, and then we can directly set the label value by using the dot notation. What I did to test this is to create a custom button, command button, sorry, that is going to call the set LWC property method. Let's try that out. We can here, this is the button, right? And pay attention to this label, because if I pressed here, yeah, the label changed the value. Okay, so that's one way in which you can send information to the Lightning Web Component. And the other way is to, well, again, sorry, I don't know what happened with this, but it's not configured as it should be. Okay, so the second way is to call a Lightning Web Component method. For that, I have created another command button. And the way to call the Lightning Web Component method is very simple. Again, what we have to do is to query for the element of the DOM that is the Lightning Web Component, and then we can call a method using the parentheses, and even you can pass some parameters here if you want. This method is a public method that we have defined in the Lightning Web Component. You define public methods and public properties by using a decorator, which is the API decorator imported here at the top, if you didn't know about that method, about public properties and methods before. So in this method, what we are going to do is that each time that it is invoked, we are going to change a property, which is message, and we are going to update the number of times that the method is invoked. We are going to keep track of that. If we take a look at the markup of the component, there is an element here in which I'm showing the message. So let's try that out. Okay, let's go to the page again. And I will try not to change with the trackpad. Okay, so pay attention to this paragraph here, because this is what we are going to change by invoking the method. This is the button that we define in the Visualforce page that we are going to press, and there you have. If I press here, I'm calling the method on the child component, and I'm changing its message value. Great. So what's missing now? We need to test how to pass information from the Lightning Web Component to the Visualforce page. And for that, what we have to do is to fire an event from the Lightning Web Component and make it propagate and escape the shadow boundary. The shadow boundary is a boundary that exists surrounding each individual Lightning Web Component. And if you want events to be able to surpass that boundary, you have to configure them specifically. So here what we have done is to create a button that has a handler. And this handler, when we click on the Lightning Web Component button, is going to dispatch an event. The way to configure the event to escape the shadow boundary is to configure it as bubbles true and compose true. Okay, both properties need to be true. Then the other part, the code that we have to implement in the Visualforce page, is a listener for that event. You can do that in several ways, but what I did here was, when the component was added to the Visualforce page, I did a query selector again to get the component element, and then I added an event listener. Here I'm using the same event name that I defined here. And what I'm going to do is to call a function called handle LWC event each time that an event is listened. We take a look at that function. The principle is similar to what I did before. What I'm going to do here is to look for a paragraph inside the Visualforce page, and I'm going to update the content to represent the number of times that the event was listened, and I'm going to keep track of that number of times. We take a look at the paragraph, is this one here, that has an initial value of 0 messages listened, and we are going to increment that. So finally, if I click this button, pay attention to this message here because it should change. Yeah, and there we have, right? So this is a way to pass information up from a Lightning Web Component to a Visualforce page when you are using Lightning Components for Visualforce, but also, for example, if you are composing two Lightning Web Components together, or even an Aura component with a Lightning Web Component. Okay, so with that, I'm going to give the control to Peter.
All right, great. Thanks a lot, Alba. Hey, before we continue, though, I had a couple of questions that I thought I'd ask about using the Visualforce, the Lightning components for Visualforce features. And the first one is, I know that this feature is using Lightning Out, and that Lightning Out is in beta. So what does that mean as far as the release status for Lightning components for Visualforce?
Yeah, so it's true that Lightning Out in a generic sense is beta. If you want to use Lightning Out in outside of the platform, that feature is beta. But Lightning components for Visualforce is GA. So you can use this feature right away, both for Aura and for Lightning Web Components. Right?
Excellent. Cool. And then the other question I had was, I noticed that you included just one Lightning Web Component in your Visualforce page. Am I limited to just one of those?
No, you are not limited. You can define as many dependencies with Lightning Web Components as you want to in your standalone Aura app. The only limitation is that you have to use the same Aura app in for every Visualforce page, but you can include as many Lightning Web Components dependencies as you need to.
So there's like one standalone app, but then you compose it of many different components. Okay, cool. And then last question, can I use any base component with Lightning components for Visualforce?
Okay, so that is a good question. Most of the base components are supported at the moment, but some of them are not. A good way to check that is to go to the components reference in the Lightning Web Components library, and there is a section on the top right corner that says experiences. That section defines the experiences that are supported. The experience that needs to be supported is a standalone Aura app, that one.
Got it. Okay, cool. Excellent. That was great. It's been a long time since I used either Lightning Out or the Lightning for Visualforce, so it was a good refresher. And it's pretty powerful, like the ability to be able to pass events back and forth. And that actually really aligns well with Lightning Message Service. So let's kick this off and talk a little bit about that. Now, Lightning Message Service, if you think back to how Aura works, Aura has an event feature that allowed you to sort of bubble events all over the place. And when we launched Lightning Web Components, that feature didn't support Lightning Web Components. It only works for Aura. So we were looking for a way to duplicate that functionality, to have a kind of cross-DOM functionality, but that works in all of the Salesforce UI technologies. So if we look at what the principles of Lightning Message Service are, the first one is client-side event bus that works between DOM branches. And the second one is equal citizens for Lightning Web Components, Aura, and Visualforce. So that's really the core piece of what Lightning Message Service is. There's sort of a third thing, which is don't be surprising. There was a feature of Aura events where you could fire off an event and it would actually trigger an update on a component that was not visible. And that threw some people off. So Lightning Message Service has launched with a feature called Scope that allows you to determine whether an active but not selected part of the UI can actually trigger functionality on a component. Now, I'm not going to talk about Scope in this particular presentation, but when I talk about Lightning Message Service, I try and make sure I talk about those three core principles. But keep an eye out because we're going to be hopefully doing some additional content on Scope in the near future. Just to illustrate those principles a little bit, when we talk about communication between DOM branches, this is what we mean. We have potentially very complex, large DOM branches that, the standard custom event dispatching functionality that exactly what Alba showed a little bit earlier, it's very difficult to have messages pass between, deep points in those two DOM branches. So the Lightning Message Service Publish is intended to be able to send a message across between those very complex DOM branches. And this screenshot is meant to illustrate that a little bit, where we have a number of different places on this user interface. In this case, we're showing a console application. So we have console tabs, console subtabs. We have the utility bar pop-ups. We even have a utility bar window. So this is actually a separate browser window that's been popped up. And all of these are places where you can fire a message off and have it be received and listened to by another component that's subscribing to that message. And you can imagine that in the complexity of this DOM, just trying to bubble up an event, a standard DOM event or a custom DOM event, would be very tricky to make this work. So that's the whole point behind LMS. And then, as we said, we wanted to make sure that Lightning Web Components, Aura, and Visualforce were all equal citizens with Lightning Message Service. So that means no matter where I fire an event from, whichever technology it's being fired from, any of those other technologies can be subscribing to it. And that brings us to this discussion about using, how to use Visualforce in Lightning. So the Lightning Message Service architecture is comprised of two key features that you need to make sure are in place. The first is a message channel, and this will be a named message. And I'll show you how that's configured. It's actually configured in XML. It lives in part of your project. It kind of looks like a custom object by name with that ~C suffix, but just be aware that this has nothing to do with custom objects. It, in fact, never really goes to the server. It is purely client-side. So just bear that in mind. And then the other part of it is the message service itself. And the message service has a few different APIs, but the most important ones are publish, subscribe, and unsubscribe. Publish being the way to send a message over LMS, and subscribe being a way to ensure that some component or Visualforce page can listen for messages on a given message channel, and then we'll have a callback function to respond to that. Unsubscribe, of course, this works really well if you want to explicitly subscribe and unsubscribe. In my examples, though, I'm attaching the subscription to the page load. So, essentially, my Visualforce pages are going to automatically load, automatically subscribe the minute that they are available in the DOM. And then I'm actually going to be showing this in the context of the Lightning Web Components Recipes app. This is some work that I was doing as LMS went into beta, where I wanted to show an example. In fact, it's the screenshot that I showed earlier that showed LWC, Aura, and Visualforce all side by side, all publishing and subscribing to a single message channel. And so, the Visualforce recipes are comprised of a publisher, and you can see that on the top there, the top row. There's also a subscriber that uses Visualforce Postback, another subscriber using Visualforce Remoting. All of the actual code or the JavaScript behind this is sitting in a set of static resources. And because we have Visualforce remoting, in those cases, we have to manually create the DOM. So there's a templates.js as well in that static resource. And all of my JavaScript is actually using ES6 modules for their architecture. So basically, each page is going to do an import, and then that's going to make use of that. All right, and that kind of brings me to my demo. So let's go and take a look at that. Where are we? There we go. So this is the Lightning Web Components Recipes app. This is available as one of the sample apps. If you actually go to the Trailhead apps, github.org, you can find all our sample apps. And if I go to the message service tab here, you'll actually see the examples that we created. And so each of these examples, the web component, the Aura component, and the Visualforce page, publishes a message over the same message channel. And then if I scroll down a little bit, you'll see that there are also subscribers to these. So if I click on Michael Jones here, for example, I can see that all 4 of the subscribers have picked up that message, and they're going and retrieving that one record. So let's go take a look. And in this case, because we're talking about including Visualforce in Lightning, I'm just going to focus on how we accomplish the Visualforce implementation of this. However, there are some recordings out there that talk about all 3 of these if you want to take a look at those. Okay, so here I am, and to get started, we're actually looking at the message channel itself. So the message channel you can see over here is called record_selected. Now what you'll see is that when I reference that via API name, it appends on that __C suffix. And that, in fact, is a completely implicit feature. So that's not something you specify. It's something that's just sort of automatically specified by the framework. All right, so moving on. What we have here is the publisher Visualforce page. Now, this publisher Visualforce page is actually using JavaScript remoting to fetch the data. And so you can kind of see a little bit of that down here. I'm not going to focus on that part. I just want to focus on the implementation of Lightning Message Service and how that works. So this is where I'm importing that ES6 module, which includes that LMS Publisher Visualforce page. And that actually exports a single function called setPageConfigs. And the reason for this is that the way that I access the message channel is via a binding to the $message channel global object or global variable. So I access that global variable, and I'm going to pass it in to this message channel config. Now, there's some Visualforce remoting functionality that I'm passing in as well. Obviously, that has nothing to do with Lightning Message Service. But I also have this LMS publish, and this is actually where I'm going to pass in the sforce.one publish function. So all of these APIs hang off of the sforce.one object in Visualforce in the Visualforce implementation. Let's go take a look at the JavaScript. All right. So you can see here, setPageConfigs passes those configs into this local object, And then that's what I'm going to be using to actually invoke the publish. So handle contact selected is actually what's happening on the Visualforce page when I select a contact. And then you can see here that that's using the LMS publish function that I've passed in from the Visualforce page context. And then you can also see it's using the message channel as well. And then what do I actually pass over? Well, it's this payload object. So essentially, I'm getting an ID value from a data set. I'm assigning it as record ID, and then I pass that over the message channel. Now, the one thing I want to mention here is that when you have a message channel, the only thing that is actually type checked when you store this back in Salesforce is the message channel name. So that record ID property that I set, that is not actually checked, even though if you go back here to the message channel, you can see that it's declared as a field. Those fields are kind of, suggestion and documentation, but there is no checking for that when you actually save that back to Salesforce. All right, so let's go take a look at how we're doing the the subscribers rather. Okay, so this is a subscriber, and this particular subscriber is using pretty standard Visualforce functionality in that it is using action function. So I'm kind of using the old original postback functionality in Apex. And I have an Apex controller that has a refresh contact method that's been surfaced from it. And then I am getting access to it using action function by calling this refresh contacts function. So essentially what I need to make sure that I do with this particular Visualforce page is to go back and invoke this refresh contact function. And all that's going to do is go and fetch a contact in Apex using a record ID. And then I'm using a re-render, and anybody who's used the old classic Visualforce postback knows that that's what triggers a partial page refresh. And if I go and look for contact list up here, I'll see there it is, there's contact list. So essentially, I have an output panel that's then going to be refreshed. Now, if you recall, Alba talked about one of the ways to make your Visualforce page look like Lightning Experience is to use Apex SLDS, and that's exactly what I've done here. So when I go and look at this, I'm not going to be able to tell the difference between this Visualforce page and the rest of Lightning Experience. All right, so let's go take a look finally at how we're going. It's the same pattern that I used before for including the static resource, where that's the JavaScript module I'll include. There's my set page configs function that I'm exporting from that JavaScript module. I pass in the message channel. And in this case, I'm going to pass in subscribe and that refresh contacts function that I need to invoke as part of the callback. All right. So again, there's our page configs. We do the assign. And the key here is that I need to subscribe to this when the page is ready. And I'm doing that on the event listener for ready state change. And then I have wrapped the subscription in a subscribe to message channel function you can see above. I pass the message channel to that along with my postback function that's back here. And that's what goes and actually re-invokes the action function. In the subscription, I pass the channel. Again, that's the channel that was passed from right here. And I pass that handler as well. Again, there's the handler specified there. So it's pretty straightforward. I simply, add my subscription. I add what the handler is going to be. I make sure it knows what the message channel, and I'm off and running. Now, what's cool is that this same pattern works really, really well, even if I'm using Visualforce remoting. So let's go take a look at that page. So in this case, it's the exact same thing where I pass in the message channel. I pass in the API, the subscribe API. I'm going to pass in the API to actually invoke the Visualforce remoting. So of course, that's going to be there as well. Let's go take a look at that JavaScript module. All right, so all the same story here. We have the page configs object that has the items that I've passed in. We have the onReady state change event listener, and then that invokes subscribe to message channel, where we actually, from there, we invoke the LMS subscribe, where we pass in the channel and the handler. And again, in this case, the actual handler itself is going to invoke the remote object. It's going to go and fetch the record, and then it's going to manually create the DOM locally, which is how the remote object works. Is essentially we're going to manipulate the DOM locally in JavaScript, versus in the postback, it invokes the Visualforce page rendering with the partial page refresh. So that kind of goes through all the different details of how to have a publisher and a couple of different flavors of subscriber in the context of Visualforce for Lightning Message Service. And with that, let me go back to our slides.
I have some questions, Peter.
Yeah, you bet, Alba.
Okay, so the first question is, you told me that there is a payload that you can pass in the messages, but can you include anything in that payload, for example, a function?
So that's a really good question. One of the features that Lightning Message Service gives you is it's the ability to pass a message through the Visualforce iframe. So one of the ways that Visualforce is allowed to be in the same DOM as Lightning Experience is that we sandbox it into an iframe. Normally there is a post message API that allows you to traverse that iframe boundary. However, it's a pretty complex API. So essentially, Lightning Message Service for Visualforce is a lot of syntactic sugar around post message. In order to send a post message, and in order to really work across all of these complex DOMs, we have to both serialize and deserialize that message payload. And so anything that doesn't survive well being serialized in JavaScript is not a good candidate to pass over that message channel, and that includes functions. But take a look at the documentation for Lightning Message Service. Anybody who's interested in kind of knowing what you can do, it does stipulate, these are the things that you shouldn't pass over a message channel.
Okay, understood. And another question, this time a more general question, is, well, when I explained Lightning components for Visualforce, the use case was that I wanted to include a Lightning web component within a Visualforce page.
Right.
And I wonder if in that use case, you can use Lightning Message Service to pass messages between the Lightning component and the Visualforce page.
So currently, Lightning Message Service does not support Lightning out. However, in the context specifically of Lightning components for Visualforce, I don't know that it explicitly states that. My sense is that no, you would not be able to actually sort of traverse from the Visualforce page to the Lightning component in that particular context. But what you could potentially do is in that Visualforce page, you could receive the message, right? And then you could use a sort of local event handler that could then propagate that event to the Lightning component in Lightning Components for Visualforce.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I really like the demo. I think it's a very interesting technology, especially the fact that you can communicate different technologies in different DOM hierarchies. And I'm really looking forward to your sessions or recordings about the scope.
Yeah, scope is really cool. And, just to sum it up, essentially what scope allows you to do is that in certain contexts, so for example, like a tab in a console app, you can make it so the default is that those components will wake up when the tab is active and they'll go back to sleep when the tab is not active. However, if you want a component to always be active, you can explicitly tell it to basically always be awake. So there's some really cool sort of granular control that you can have over components under certain contexts.
Great.
Cool. All right, so that kind of brings us to resources, and I think most of these are yours to share, Alba.
Yeah, so well, I've shown this slide in the previous webinar, but if this is the first webinar that you watch about the Visualforce LWC series, yes, so that you know there is a new sample app called Visualforce LWC that contains typical code patterns implemented both in Visualforce, in Lightning, and LWC. And the idea is that you can see the solution and get used to the Lightning Web Components code very easily. And also there are 3 Trailhead badges related to Visualforce LWC topic. The first one is a quick start. It's a quick start for the Visualforce LWC app. Recently, we have released quick starts for several of our apps in the sample gallery, and that's going to explain to you the motivation that we had to create that app and how to deploy it, and some explanation of the code that conforms the app. So that's going to be very useful. There is another one, which is called Lightning Web Components and Salesforce Data. This one is especially interesting for Visualforce developers because the way in which you work with Salesforce data in Lightning Web Components is different to the way in which you do that in Visualforce, and you have several alternatives and you need to know which is the best one to choose for every single use case. And finally, there is another batch called Lightning Web Components for Visualforce developers, which is especially created for you, for people who are Visualforce developers and want to make the move to Lightning Web Components, and they don't know where to start. So that one is especially for you. If you can go to the next slide, Peter, I can talk about the some more resources that you can take a look for learning more about today's webinar. In the first URL, you have the code examples of the demo I did, the one about Lightning Web Components for Visualforce. And then there are some more resources about Lightning Message Service. There is a blog post that we release in summer, which is part of our Learn More series. And I think the next one is yours, Peter.
Yeah. The work that we did in the LMS Lightning Web Components recipes app. If you want like a sort of quick way to get to all the bits and pieces of that, there's actually a GitHub issue that was used to track that work, and it's kind of a quick and dirty way to go and find just the code for that. Although if you download the app and you're running it, it's really easy to get to there as well. Also, I mentioned scope very briefly. I actually created a sample that just focuses on how scope works. So if you want to go and take a look at that, that can be kind of fun to play around with.
Great. And finally, I leave you there are some other Trailhead modules that already existed that give you tips to move from Visualforce to Lightning experience in general. It gives you the information about how to configure your pages, style them, etc., etc., etc. And I think those are going to be very useful as well. So I think we have arrived to the end of the presentation.
I think so.
Yeah, it was very fun to present with you, Peter.
Yeah, me too. Thanks, Alba, and thanks everyone for listening. I hope this was helpful.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.